It's Analysing Anfield, your tactics and analytics podcast, courtesy of the Blood Red channel. I'm Guy Clarke. Welcome along. Coming up, we're talking transfers as the Reds look to have wrapped up their summer signings for this year. Discuss who could be Klopp's breakout star for 22-23. And is it finally time to unleash the 4-2-3-1? To do all of that, I'm joined by our resident tactics guru, Josh Williams. Of course, I'm sitting in for Dave Hughes. But Josh, how are you keeping?
I'm good, mate, yeah. It's nice to see you as well, transitioning from a substitute appearance player to a starter. You know, it's the transition is in motion, mate.
Well, what is it? Because obviously Divock Origi's going now, so I always say I'm playing the Divock Origi role. But if you're saying I'm beginning to make that transition, what is it? Curtis Jones, maybe? I know I'm maybe not the youthful exuberance of Curtis Jones, but trying to make a comparison.
I'd say maybe Konate, mate. I mean, Konate was on the bench a fair bit, wasn't he? Now he's becoming a bit more of a starter. It's not a bad player to follow, really, is it?
No, certainly not. No, I'll take that one all day long. Well, first up, let's get into the transfer business. I know over the last couple of weeks, there's been plenty of Darwin Nunez chat. Following that, this weekend, Calvin Ramsay arriving from Aberdeen as well, with Fabio Carvalho long having been known that he's heading to Anfield. 3 in the door. What are your thoughts? Happy with that? And by all indications, we're hearing that's going to be it. Is it enough?
I think what I'm most happy with is the speed of the deals. You know, to get everything done by the end of June. Not even the end of June, really. You know, it was before that, wasn't it? It was like mid-June. So to get everything done, it kind of epitomises for me how well-oiled Liverpool's recruitment department is. Everything's obviously being planned months in advance. That's the perks of being stable on the training ground, stable in the back room. It's what consistency gives you. You know, you can plan ahead. You're not dealing with upheaval. Say, for example, if you look at Manchester United, it seems to be new faces, but similar story in terms of moving things a little bit slowly. So what I'm most happy about is how quickly Liverpool have done their business. I think Konate certainly last season benefited from having a full pre-season with the club. And now this year, once the players return from the holidays, Ramsay, Carvalho and Nunez are all going to benefit from that. So that's nice to see. In terms of whether Liverpool are equipped to go again, I think they are, but there is this underlying frustration that seems to be a recurring theme when it comes to the transfer market. Every club, including Liverpool, always just seems to be one player away from feeling like you've got a complete squad with no voids almost. Liverpool always seems to have at least one player who seems to be missing. That for me is a midfielder. But despite that, we have plenty of options across the park, lots of flexibility. And again, crucially, Liverpool have brought down the average age as well this summer, getting in 2 teenagers and potentially in another star who's 22 years old at the minute. So I think he's 23 now, actually. But yeah, all things considered, I'm happy with what's gone on.
You mentioned the one player short thing. Do you think that Liverpool can, at the end of the day, afford to be going and getting another player for what it would be on the wage bill? I mean, even if they were to make room in the squad, you'd probably be looking, I'd imagine, at 2, maybe even 3 players going. Jude Bellingham's been one name that has been touted around. Now, it's not an infinite pot of money that Liverpool have to bring in these players all the time. And yet, if you're going to make room for a star signing to come in, they're going to want to know that they're playing an awful lot of football. And as I say, there's already in that midfield 8 options. If you think about it, if you brought in a 9th, surely even without the economics, it's probably 2 needing to move on to make that person coming in feel as though they're definitely going to get enough game time.
Yeah, and I think since the Tchouaméni deal kind of broke down and word spread that Liverpool were potentially going to wait a year for Bellingham, on the back of that, I've read the odd little reports saying that Oxlade-Chamberlain might just run his contract down at the club. I personally thought he'd get sold this summer, but that they're the kind of subtle adjustments you can make to remain flexible in the market, basically. So if Liverpool don't get Tchouaméni in, have to wait a year for Bellingham, okay, keep Chamberlain for another 12 months. Just little things like that. So, as I said, I do think Liverpool are covered, and I do think the money is there if a player like Bellingham was to become available this summer. But I think his contract expires in 2025. So if he was going to move this summer, it would be for a lot. Whereas next summer, 2 years left on his deal, Dortmund aren't in as strong of a position. Similar to Man United with Sancho, really. When Sancho did eventually go to United, it wasn't for anywhere near the initial figures quoted. It was for about 70 million, maybe. Whereas the quotations the year before were like 105 million and things like that. So I do think it makes general sense for Liverpool to go for Bellingham next season. And if in the meantime you have to keep hold of the likes of Ox, who's going to play, I don't know, I don't think he's going to start many Premier League games, put it that way. I think it's fine, really, just to ensure that you get the right man in the door.
Yeah, I think it's between 10 and 15 million that's been quoted on Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain. To me, I wouldn't say that there seems too much sense in what that's going to then offer to bring another player in. As I say, it would then be another sale on top of that, probably, that you'd be looking to do to bring a new midfield player in. I personally completely see the logic, but then as it stands, you've got Naby Keita, Mohamed Salah, and Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain all heading into the final year of their contracts. We understand, of course, Naby Keita is on that list for players to negotiate with for a new contract, but Mohamed Salah, the negotiations have been going on for so long now, so it will be interesting to see how it goes. But the other point you were mentioning there of the three players coming in is the age profile of them. It definitely is a case, isn't it, of looking to the future and a real indication of what the next incarnation of Liverpool may well be. We'll get onto it later in terms of a tactical perspective, but it seems since Jurgen Klopp signed this new contract this summer with Julian Ward coming in as well, the emphasis has been on hit that refresh button and really start putting in some maybe cornerstones into what the next great Liverpool side can look like.
Yeah, well, part of me did wonder, I know Klopp's new contract seemed to coincide with comments made by his wife and things like that, and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's interesting that it's also coincided with Liverpool seeming intent on building the next squad. I think maybe there was a bit of a question in the back of Klopp's mind. Are we going to be able to build a team like this again in terms of getting your Salah right, getting your Mane right, getting your Firmino, players like that? But I think since he's seen evidence of Liverpool starting to put those wheels in motion, specifically signing Diaz in January, Konate looks like another great buy, only 22, 23 years old. And then obviously Nunez this summer. I do think it's just kind of revitalised the whole thing. I liked that Liverpool were using 4-3-3 relentlessly. I liked that Liverpool had a very obvious profile across the board, in terms of across the pitch, different positions and stuff. But ultimately, maybe it has got to a point where things aren't stale by any means, but maybe in terms of maximising what you can do in the confines of that 4-3-3, maybe Klopp's kind of squeezed every little drop out of that 4-3-3 in terms of how he can evolve it, how players can continue learning despite the system remaining the same. And maybe moving forward, he's opening up the prospect of using different shapes, using different positions compared to previous ones, roles and things like that in terms of a number 10 potentially and a fixed striker and players like that. So, yeah, I think it's just all about Liverpool gradually evolving. And I've said in the past that when it comes to bedding in these youngsters, you kind of want that Man United, Sir Alex Ferguson dynamic where those youngsters are coming through with bags of potential. And they've got those established stars to look up to in the likes of Van Dijk and Henderson and Salah and those players who have been man the block, basically.
Yeah, and they can learn from them, can't they, on the training pitch as they go. We'll talk about the breakout stars second half of the pod and nail down on that kind of 4-2-3-1 and the tactical options that Jurgen Klopp has, because I know certainly through that first lockdown many moons ago, yourself and Dave did a brilliant series of kind of trying to replicate Liverpool in how they are with what players they could go and sign. I know a couple of the players that mentioned, in fact, Diogo Jota was one of them, did end up making his way to Liverpool. But I just wonder the profiles of the players signed. There's been a lot said about Calvin Ramsay that he can be effectively what Trent is like as a deputy and understudy to him at right back. But in Carvalho and in Darwin Nunez in particular, to me, they don't fit the profiles of what's already in the squad. And therefore, rather than try and replicate the 4-3-3 and what Liverpool already have, actually, Do you think Klopp's looking at it and thinking we're better suited to evolve the shape, the system, how we go about things? Of course, as Pep Lijnders says, pressing is our intensity is our identity, and it is all about pressing. The core philosophies aren't going to change, but with the profiles of players, it might well be that they line up slightly differently tactically.
Yeah, I mean, I should probably say that. I think in Carvalho and Nunez, I do think they are Liverpool type signings. I think they're Liverpool type players in terms of what they offer and the analytics background, the age of them, potential ceiling, attacker natured, things like that. But I agree with you in terms of a tactical profile, I suppose, and where they like to play on the pitch and how they like to play. They don't traditionally fit Klopp's 4-3-3. But I must say that a lot of the details to do with Klopp's 4-3-3, specifically in attack and how it works in attack, it was because of Firmino. When Klopp got to the club, Firmino was pretty much the only attacker there that he could build around with the future. I think Firmino was about 24 at the time. Coutinho was also quite young. But I think the long-term view with Coutinho was that he was going to bring in a hefty price tag, basically. So Firmino was the player that Klopp was going to build around. We needed a number 9 at the time. Firmino was installed there, interpreted the role a little bit like a false 9. And then on the back of that, what you couple up with a false 9 naturally is quick, wide forwards who are penetrative and goal orientated. And the system kind of worked on the back of that. And I think now, we always talked about how Liverpool are going to keep that going. Who could be the next Firmino? You know, could it be someone like Kai Havertz or João Felix or whatever? But I think the bottom line is Firmino is quite unique, and it's difficult to find another player like him. He's obviously 30 or 31 years old now. His contract expires next summer. And it's about getting in that next number 9. It doesn't necessarily have to be a false 9. It just has to be another top player, essentially, who's going to provide years of service at Anfield. And I think Liverpool have scoured the market, and the best available player has been Nunez. And I think he is going to shape Liverpool's next attack, essentially. And given his specific skill set, how he behaves and things like that on the pitch, I do think it makes a bit of sense to install a number 10 behind him, as opposed to leaving that space vacant, which was the case with Firmino, because Firmino naturally drops into those spaces. So I think across the board since the start, Liverpool have always been quite fluid tactically. But I think the overall system, the makeup of it in attack, I think was initially decided by Firmino, who was just already at the club.
Do you think it's as easy as just saying, "Oh, it would be 4-2-3-1"? Or equally, the end of last season, one thing that struck me so much was certainly when games needed affecting and changing, and it was where that deep attacking roster that Jurgen Klopp had to pick from really came into full effect, was when he went 4-2-3, 4-2-4, as it were. He did it in the derby against Everton when they really sat in, and obviously Origi came on. He was that box player, which I suppose you can say Nunez can inherit that kind of role. But equally, you do still have a player like Diogo Jota about who can still be so versatile in fitting into any one of those forward option positions that are needed.
Well, I think although 4-2-3-1 is the talk, I don't think it'll be a strict change to 4-2-3-1 next season, and we barely see anything else. I think next season it could potentially be a case of close to 50-50 between 4-2-3-1 and 4-3-3, and then maybe the season after, that's when 4-2-3-1 becomes the first choice, the go-to system. And in between that, you obviously have the options of occasionally going for a 4-4-2 and systems like that. But this is the beauty of having tactically flexible players who can play across the board, different positions. Klopp's always shown an interest in that. Initially, it was so that he could have a small squad, but now the demands of the calendar and the aspirations of Liverpool to compete across the board in different tournaments, you almost need more numbers, and some of those numbers are originating from the academy now, which has allowed Liverpool to get even stronger in terms of the squad. But as I said, 4-2-3-1, I do think it will definitely be more prominent this season. But I don't think it will be a total switch. I think we will see a balanced switch between 4-3-3 and 4-2-3-1, depending on who's available, who we're facing, where the match is, all that sort of stuff.
I was going to say with Mohamed Salah in particular, still staying around as he's confirmed for next season at the very least. You said 4-3-3 really benefits with someone who can drop deeper in that kind of false nine position. Really benefits those wide goal scoring wingers, which Mohamed Salah has been a brilliant exponent of the formation. And it looks as though Luis Diaz has the skill set and criteria to fit that, albeit maybe the goal returns haven't quite been as high as Liverpool would hope or maybe even expect. But he has been in the first 6 months of time at Liverpool, adapting to a new country, a new language, and everything that goes with it. So I suppose when you look at it, as long as Mohamed Salah's around, surely 4-3-3 will be option number one. But the profile of the other players in the squad, I suppose if you've got a 4-2-3-1, it allows you to exert more control on the game at the top end of the pitch and really get that gegenpress going with the forward players really pushing into the opposition's defensive third to win the ball back easily because you've naturally got more players higher up the pitch. But equally, the burden of the goal scoring load can be shared, which with Sadio Mane leaving, Divock Origi leaving, as well as Takumi Minamino, there is going to be a need, isn't there, for more goal scoring to be shared around the team, and it maybe not just be on the two wide goal scoring forwards, to have all of the concentration on them for getting the goals.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Salah, what I will say is Salah does have experience of playing in a 4-2-3-1. In the season before Liverpool signed him for Roma, that was the formation that they were playing. Edin Dzeko was the main man, leading the line. 6'4" or so. I think he scored 29 Serie A goals that season. Salah played on the right, like he does for Liverpool, but he played, as I said, behind a number 9 and alongside number 10. And that season, Salah scored 15 in Serie A, which is still good for a wide player. And he registered 11 assists. Now, that total of 11 assists, he's only ever bettered in a single season once. A single league season, this is once. And that was this season, fully enough. Salah posted 13 assists in the Premier League this year. But before that, his previous best was at Roma. And one thing Salah's always been, I felt, has always been an overlooked element of Salah's game. Although he's obviously a scorer, there's always been this narrative that he's selfish. I suppose it depends what you mean by that. But in terms of Salah being a creator, I've always felt it's a very underrated element of his game. I think he's really good at balancing the goals with the assists side of things, the scoring goals, finding the net, with the creating chances for his teammates. Salah can do both of those to a very high level, in my opinion. So within the confines of 4-2-3-1, I still think he'd be a very effective presence. And I think it does make sense overall to move the team towards a bit of a shift in tactics, whereby maybe Nunez hoovers up more of the shots in the team compared to Salah, who might not be there beyond 12 months. And when it comes to Diaz on the opposite side, one of the beauties of Diaz is he does have that Salah nature about him, where he can come inside, score goals and things, but he's also very, very, very much a winger, I think, at times. Likes to engage in 1v1 battles out wide, goes direct at his man all the time. Decent crossover of the ball, can play on both flanks. So when it comes to Diaz, he is quite adaptable, depending on different formations. So, as I said, I think Liverpool have the makeup in attacking areas this season to really mix it up. And I thought it was interesting, actually, on the back of the Champions League final, Carlo Ancelotti said that Liverpool were easy to analyse or something like that, I think he said. Ancelotti's faced Liverpool a number of times. 4-3-3 is always the way. Wide forward is always the way. And, Ancelotti genuinely gets decent results against Klopp. But on the back of this season, going into this season, based on the business we've done, maybe that's going to be harder for opposing teams to do.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move on then, with that in mind and how Liverpool could change things up and the signings they've made, to talk about who could be the breakout stars, the big names that we could this time next year be talking about as staple players. I think certainly first half of last season, Diogo Jota certainly was a man who was able to lay claim to that. Second half of the season maybe didn't go as he would have liked, and maybe didn't get as many of the opportunities as he would have liked. But it is always interesting. And now looking at Liverpool, and it does feel this summer is maybe a bit of a summer of significance in terms of a shift, whether it's tactical or certainly behind the scenes, with Julian Ward replacing Michael Edwards, Sadio Mane moving on, Divock Origi equally moving on as well. The sands maybe are shifting a bit at Liverpool, and the responsibility may fall onto other players. And I have to say, Josh, we were talking before, obviously recording, about what we were going to talk about and who could be the breakout stars for this season for Liverpool. To me, there are so many contenders.
Well, one of the major contenders, I suppose, is Fabio Carvalho, and you yourself have more experience than I do, I suppose, of watching him based on your time in the Championship, mate.
Yeah, no, he's a player who I have to say I am very excited to see how he deals with making the step up to the Premier League. Absolutely lit up the Championship last season. He is only 19 years of age and really fits into that profile of the young stars that Liverpool are signing. He ticks the homegrown box as well. And I think with what you were saying of maybe moving to a 4-2-3-1, I think if that is going to happen, I think he could really excel in that number 10 role. Now, I don't think it'd be fair to expect a 19-year-old to be the first choice number 10 for a team right at the top of the game like Liverpool. But equally, I do think this year maybe we will see through the course of the season, if that is the tactic that's adopted, that you really do begin to see him come into that. I think having watched him, he is such a brilliant ball carrier. He can play kind of those defence splitting passes as well. And I think equally playing with a player like Harry Wilson at Fulham, who played off that right-hand side left-footed in a 4-2-3-1 with a focal point like Aleksandar Mitrovic, I actually think you're just putting better players around him if it's to be that same kind of system, and can really kind of, I suppose, extract maximum output from him with playing the likes of Salah and potentially Darwin Nunez as well. Now, 2/3 of that attack that I mentioned would be brand new to being in the system. And on the left, you'd probably have Luis Diaz or Diogo Jota. So I wouldn't expect it to be something from day one that is kind of looked at by Jurgen Klopp and that is how they go. But equally, I think if you think of that in a 4-2-3-1 of Salah, Carvalho, Diaz and Darwin Nunez or Diogo Jota, I think personally that would be a really exciting kind of forward line that Liverpool could potentially unlock. And Fabio Carvalho, I think, is going to be a player who, for the long term for Liverpool, is really going to grow and develop. And maybe this season, straight from the off, we'll begin to see that breakthrough.
Yeah, do you know what? I think he's going to be a really, really underrated player for Liverpool. I think this time next season, say maybe 19 games in at the halfway point, I think we'll be reflecting on his signing as a real piece of expertise when it comes to Liverpool's transfer moves. You just look at what he offers as a player. I mean, for a start, you mentioned there that he's homegrown. The large majority of players that you have to sign at the top level, at least in terms of like the Manchester City, Arsenal, Liverpool, Chelsea, those teams obviously have to acquire homegrown players to meet certain rules, but you have to be a certain level to play for those clubs. So a lot of the time, those homegrown players go for 50 million plus. You know, if you think of Ben White, Ben Chilwell, Aaron Wan-Bissaka, Kyle Walker,
Jadon Sancho,
yeah, Jude Bellingham, whatever he will go for. You know, I'm sure there's many more off the top of me. Declan Rice, you know, is going to go for a lot. Generally, those players are very, very expensive. Liverpool have just got a homegrown teenager who is, as you say, lit up the Championship there for buttons relative terms. So, considering that, it's an expert move. And if you look at his output as well across the board, he's, as I said, he's still a teenager, and the numbers he's posted in comparison to other teenage players, not just who are homegrown, but across the whole of Europe, he is a real find. I'm telling you. And
yeah, I agree, and I think a lot of people who might listen and think, well, he's a big step to take up from the Championship to get to where he's going to have to get to. go back a couple of years and see what Mason Mount did at Derby County and stepped up. And that was a Derby County side that only finished in the top 6 and reached the playoff final. This is a Fulham team that not only won the league, they scored the most ever goals that have been scored at second tier level. They walked the division. Yes, as I say, they had someone like Mitrovic at the top end of the pitch, but he needed supplying. And whilst, maybe not every assist came from him, a lot of them, as I said before, came from Harry Wilson. In the build-up to those moves was Fabio Carvalho, and he had a bit of a spell out of the side. I think it was in the autumn through injury. Came back in second half of the season, and admittedly, after the Liverpool transfer talk had really intensified, and it was clear that Liverpool were very keen on him to play a very crucial role in the run-in for them. And like you, I can't imagine first half of the season he's probably going to play an awful lot, but because we know what Klopp's like with getting players used to the system and holding them back, and he's the expert of waiting until a player is fine-tuned into the system before then releasing it and going, yep, you know what, here we go. And I think you look at the Liverpool squad makeup and the players who aren't going to the World Cup. To me, there would be an awful lot of room on the training ground for first part of the season for Liverpool to be training the 4-2-3-1 almost behind closed doors, the best kept secret that we know Liverpool are going to unlock, of having Luis Diaz, who's not, I think I'm right in saying, going to the World Cup with Colombia. Mohamed Salah isn't with Egypt. Fabio Carvalho, I wouldn't imagine, is going to be part of the Portuguese senior setup, given he's playing in the under-21s at the moment. And then, therefore, when they come back from the World Cup, you've effectively got that supply line in behind whoever's going to play as the focal number 9, ready to go into what could potentially be a devastating new old system, if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah, well, one of the perks attached to his profile as well, this is on top of everything I've just listed before, is although he's a number 10, he's previously came out and said he most enjoys, I think he said, playing as a wide forward. And then I think you could also, considering how Harvey Elliot did, particularly at the beginning of last season, I think you could also, in certain situations, deploy him as a number 8 in a 4-3-3 as well. So
I think the left-hand side of that 4-3-3 would, personally, if you said to me right now, where would he play for Liverpool? I would say that would be the most natural fit for him, because I think a bit like Elliott, I don't know if he's quite dynamic and explosive enough to play as a wide forward in the 4-3-3.
Yeah.
But equally, again, the 4-2-3-1, he could probably play in a wide role like that, like Harvey Elliott did when he went on loan to Blackburn Rovers. But I don't think in the 4-3-3 he would play as an out-and-out forward. But it has been being spoken about with Carvalho coming in that he is going to be a forward option for Liverpool. So again, is that a hint to 4-2-3-1?
Well, it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on whether the comparisons to Coutinho are in any way accurate, because sometimes those comparisons can emerge and he can be quite lazy. You know, both players have played for Liverpool or are going to play for Liverpool. In Carvalho's case, they even look relatively comparable. And in terms of their nature, their playing style, I suppose, is relatively similar. I actually think there's a lot in it. In terms of how you would use the players. Again, Coutinho wasn't really quick enough to be a proper wide forward for Klopp, but he wasn't really, playing him as an 8 was a bit of a defensive risk. You could play him as a 10, very technical, shorter than the large majority of his peers, but despite that, he couldn't really get the ball off him. Dynamic on the ball. So I think there's lots of comparisons there, but I think in Carvalho's sense, in comparison, I would say he's like Coutinho, right? But I think he's got a bit more of an engine defensively. I think he's a bit more inclined to work defensively in terms of pressure regains and things like that. So he's a bit more in a Klopp mode in that sense, but maybe a bit less inclined to do the extraordinary and win a game on his own and score a goal from 30 yards. But other than that, he's very comparable, just a bit more in the mold of what Klopp would have liked from Coutinho. It remains to be seen if he'll be as special as him on the ball. Have you got any thoughts on comparisons there?
No, I do agree with you a lot on kind of that Coutinho thing, and you don't want to burden a player, do you, with a big name like that? But for example, when Liverpool sold Coutinho, everybody immediately is clamouring for saying, "Oh, who's going to be the Coutinho replacement? Who are Liverpool going to sign to replace Coutinho?" Coutinho left in January 2018, I think I'm right in saying. So it's 4.5 years later. But again, it feeds into what Liverpool do. They don't just go and search the market and say, right, who's the next best version of Coutinho at that present moment. They wait until a talent comes available to say, actually, is this guy worth bringing in? And again, is it going to be worth seeing a tactical shift? Because we saw how devastating in the first half of Coutinho's final season Liverpool were with having that four strong forward line, with Salah and Coutinho linking up within that, Mane and Firmino as well, and a possibility of whether they go back to that. I agree with you as well that I don't think he's probably capable of the individual spectacular quite like Coutinho was the long range shooting. But equally, at times that was a frustration for Liverpool that Coutinho would shoot from range as often as he would. Equally, there would be some impressive returns from it at certain points. But I think what you say as well of him being more pressing, I think that's just a product of being brought through in the modern era.
Yeah, I agree.
Coutinho by no means is old, but if you look at Fabio Carvalho's birthday, it's the 30th of August 2002. So Jurgen Klopp, go back to when he really introduced pressing at Borussia Dortmund and won that first league title in 2011. Fabio Carvalho at the beginning of that season would have been 8 or 9 years old, would have been playing his formative football and come through during the era where pressing has really become prevalent and would have been trained within thinking about defensive actions right from being a young player. Whereas Coutinho, it probably wasn't until he arrived at Liverpool where it was then right, adjust your game and see if you can get that defensive onus and responsibility within part of your game. But I think their profile, their stature, and how they look to play the game, I would say, is similar. And maybe it could be the reason that Liverpool revert to the 4-2-3-1. But I think we should talk about some other players as well. Harvey Elliott's one I'm really intrigued by because I know this time last year he was a player myself I was really rooting for and tipping to do good things. Equally thought that might have been as an understudy to Mohamed Salah and seen him rested a bit. But it was more in that midfield area where, of course, he picked up the injury, but looked very impressive within that. And I just wonder this season, Josh, whether you think he'll go again, take his game to a next level, and actually if you think he'll stay in the midfield, or again if he will graduate towards playing in an attacking role.
Well, again, I feel like this one depends upon the development of the team, really. Because I see, if Elliott's going to play in central midfield, it's going to be as part of a 3. For me, there's no way he can play as part of a 2. So that would rule out 4-2-3-1 when it comes to Elliott, unless he was to play as a number 10 in that system. Or potentially on the right, actually. I know Salah's going to occupy that spot for the next season at least. But maybe that's a nice move for Elliott, considering in a 4-2-3-1, that right-sided role, which he played for Blackburn, maybe is a bit less goal-orientated if you're playing with a front 4 as opposed to a front 3, because Nunez will be getting more goals, Carvalho or Firmino or whatever will be playing as number 10. So there's a number of spots that have opened up there for Elliott, really. But in terms of a 4-3-3, definitely for me, he's the right side of number 8. I don't think he's quick enough or goal-orientated enough to be the Salah. I can't see him being the false 9, certainly. And so for me, he's a right side of number 8 in the 4-3-3. And last season, before his injury, I was really, really impressed with him. I think he's similar to Carvalho. He's got that industrious nature about him, despite him being a really creative player with a really good first touch. His decision making has always been really, really good. I was big on him last summer, and early on he was living up to that, but then he got his injury, and then when he came back, Liverpool were going for a quadruple, so it wasn't ideal for him. But Elliott is another one to watch next season. Lots of potential, and I mean, how old is he now? Is he still a teenager?
Yeah, he's 19, turned 19 in April.
Yeah, see, in Harvey Elliot there and Carvalho, funny enough, 2 players from Fulham. I mean, they must be being sick. But you've got two players there who, both teenagers, both 19 years old, and both homegrown, and both just really, the sky's the limit, really, with the pair of them.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I think I'm right in saying as well, Fabio Carvalho. And in fact, Harvey Elliott has spoken about playing with Carvalho in the youth teams at Fulham in the past as well. So hopefully for Liverpool, there is an existing relationship within that can be exploited. And I'm with you within kind of the midfield. I think his season at Blackburn, I think he picked up 11 assists in the Championship in that year. And I think playing in the midfield probably feeds more into his creative side of his game rather than the goal scoring. I think he can be a player who develops into chipping in with goals, but maybe not an out-and-out goal getter that Liverpool have certainly had from that wide right under Mohamed Salah for the 5 years that he's been at the club. Another player, though, that I think this year maybe we will see, do you think, graduate to being the first team regular? You compared him to me right at the start of the show. Is Ibrahima Konate? Is this going to be the year that he and Van Dijk really nail down that partnership between the two of them?
Yeah, I really wouldn't be surprised. I think maybe from the off, maybe Joel Matip will remain, but I think as 4-2-3-1 becomes more prominent, I think Konate will become more prominent in the team. I think I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the season he's kind of properly ousted Matip as the first choice. I mean, we are going to get to the details of 4-2-3-1, aren't we? But in terms of Konate, I think he's better 1v1 in comparison to Matip, and I think that is going to be more of a thing with 4-2-3-1. But I don't want to spoil the surprise.
No. Let's dig into that, because we have spoken an awful lot about the formational shift this year, and I know you've been asked about it prior to the episode, and hence informed a large degree why we're talking about it today and about it. But what are the benefits, the intricacies, the differences between where Liverpool have been with 4-3-3 and what they could well move to with 4-2-3-1?
Okay, well, there's a number of differences. I did get a DM during the week from one of our regular listeners who asked me to speak about this. So there's a few sort of differences, not that many, I mean, but it's just a spatial thing. But overall, there's some differences. So first of all, I think the primary difference is you're playing with a 2 in the middle of the park as opposed to a 3. So one of the ways in which that will influence the system is you naturally then have less cover for the 2 fullbacks. Robertson is not going to change in nature. Tsimikas isn't. Trent isn't. And neither is Calvin Ramsay, I'm assuming. So you're still going to be playing with those offensive fullbacks, but you're going to have one less body covering those players, essentially, because it's just harder to do as part of a 2 as opposed to a 3. Naturally, as a result of that, you're probably then going to be relying on the individual 1v1 ability of your 2 centre-halves a bit more, which is why maybe Konate makes a little bit more sense there as a player, because the number 8s, who would typically provide cover, are just going to be there a little bit less. On top of that, in terms of the 2 midfielders, they just will behave quite differently to what we're used to. The number 8s naturally are box-to-box, occupy high spaces in the half spaces and things like that, and team up with the likes of Salah in high areas. If you're playing as part of a 2, your movements are just a little bit more horizontal as opposed to vertical. So you're just kind of providing a bit of authority in deeper areas, and you almost form part of a box with your 2 centre-backs. So imagine, say, Thiago, Fabinho, Konate and Van Dijk forming like a defensive box, and kind of everybody else just going for it, essentially, in the final third. Obviously, also, you have a number 10 in there. Now, I mentioned earlier about Firmino. It didn't make much sense to field Firmino as a 9 and a number 10 behind him, because Firmino naturally drops into those number 9 spaces anyway. Number 10 spaces anyway. But in Nunez, you have a bit more of a orthodox penalty box poacher in a way. So given that, maybe it makes sense now to occupy those 10 spaces with a fixed number 10, because Nunez isn't going to do it as much. And then again, in the wide areas, maybe there's a bit more responsibility on the 2 wide men to provide more of a dual threat in terms of creation and scoring, as opposed to primarily scoring, which has been the case with Mane and Salah for the past couple of seasons. So I'd say they're the general basics of it. I mean, there's some more details in that, but I think generally that's the crux of how Liverpool would shift if they move towards a 4-2-3-1 compared to what they've usually operated in. I'm not sure if you can think of any other ones, mate.
No, it's more, I suppose, a formation of exerting control, isn't it? Which actually we've seen Liverpool move to for quite a while now under Jurgen Klopp, more of a possession and tactical game where effectively, as you say, you use those two deeper midfield sitters to almost at times lock in the opposition, and you have your higher players up the pitch able to really implement a press, and there's basically that safety blanket behind the axis of the two I suppose number 6 pivot midfield players who pick up the ball and then just keep moving it around and keep feeding it out into the wide areas and into the number 10, and you've got a number of different uh, exploitation points, I suppose, especially if the fullbacks are going high and wide as Liverpool's would do. You would have your inside forward players dropping. Also, you mentioned before about how it's kind of a horizontal role for the two midfield players. It can equally be that for the wide forwards, can't it? Rather than they go in behind the striker as Mane and Salah did so often under Roberto Firmino. Actually, they kind of come inside alongside the number 10 at times to help then link with the number 10 more and really have an intricate and precise build up to your play. But with it, in talking of kind of the midfield, then what do Liverpool have? And I suppose it goes right back to the start about transfers and people saying that a central midfield player would be ideal. And Chouameni, I remember you and Dave speaking about him back in the autumn, saying he would be a brilliant partner for Fabinho in a 4-2-3-1. Jude Bellingham, likewise, could probably fit that role too. Of the current options Liverpool have, and if the business is to be done this summer, how would you see it working then with the midfield options they have? Because off the top of my head, I would say that the four players comfortable maybe in those kind of two roles would be Fabinho, Thiago, Henderson, and James Milner. I'm not really sure if it's the kind of roles for the likes of Curtis Jones, Naby Keita, or even Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain.
Yeah, I mean, Ox in particular, I do not see a spot for him in a 4-2-3-1. For me, he's very much a number 8. I mean, maybe he would benefit as part of the attacking from 4 as a wide man, because as we've just established, there's a little bit less of an emphasis on those players in that system to score all the goals. Ox has never really been that player, so yeah, maybe he'd benefit from that. But yeah, this is why Chouameni would have been nice, and this is why maybe it makes sense again to go towards 4-2-3-1, because the likes of Henderson, Milner, and Thiago, who are still going to be integral to the team next season, they're not getting any younger. You know, they're getting quite old now, and as I've just said then, when it comes to the midfield movements in a 4-2-3-1 compared to a 4-3-3, the movements are just a bit more just side to side, more lateral, compared to going box to box all day, really covering an extensive ground. They're a bit more stepping back, overseeing things, controlling, as you said, a bit more lighthouse, you know, from deeper areas, and just letting the players ahead of them do a lot of the attacking almost. Curtis Jones is an interesting one. Before I talk about Curtis Jones, actually, Naby Keita has experience of playing this system for Leipzig. I don't think it'll be that much of a problem for Naby. I think he'll be okay. Maybe not as the deepest of the two, but if Fabinho was the deepest of the two and Naby was kind of a little bit round the corner, I think he'd be fine there. Curtis Jones, though, is an interesting one, because I'm not really sure yet where he's going or what he is. I think if I was to define him, if I was to put him in what I would label as his best position, it would be the left side of number 8 in a 4-3-3. In a 4-2-3-1, I wouldn't be defensively confident enough in him to leave him as part of a 2. Potentially as a left-sided forward, but even that feels a little bit weird. As a number 10, I don't know if he's good enough in those areas, and I don't know if he's quick enough with the decision making in those areas to do well.
Yeah, well, it was largely what the system he was playing and part of in the academy, wasn't it? And he kind of flourished certainly that last season as playing wide on the left. But as you say, he seemed to have really outgrown academy football by that stage. But I'm with you on him, and I think as much as we've also discussed breakout players for this year, I think this year is going to be so interesting in terms of the formation, because as we've discussed, I think there's so many hints that 4-2-3-1 could well be the way to go for Liverpool, and in certain scenarios. But I do think by and large it probably will stick to the 4-3-3. But I think for this season, whilst not maybe a breakout season for him, I think it could be a crucial year for Curtis Jones to really stamp his authority on why he has a long-term future at Liverpool. Because I think if he has another season, perhaps like the last one, eventually the question might well be asked of, whilst yes, he's club trained and he's homegrown, is there enough coming from him? When you think at the end of this year, I'm right in saying that Harvey Elliot would classify as club trained as well, and you've got those players who are coming through. Tyler Morton's one who we've not spoken about and came into the side a bit last year, but I think he could be comfortable in either system as well. But I do think Curtis Jones, I think it's a big season for him.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I've been asked about Curtis Jones, I've never been too worried. I've always thought he's on the right track. He's doing okay. He's still young enough where you don't need to worry. And in comparison to the players Liverpool usually sign, Liverpool don't usually sign midfielders as young as Jones is. So all of this development that Jones is going through, Liverpool signings would usually do this elsewhere, and we don't usually see it. We see the finished product at Anfield. So in Jones, we just need to be a little bit patient with him, I suppose. What I will say is, last season, I think I expected him to come on a little bit more than he did. I thought he'd be a bit more of a prominent figure at the end of the season than he actually was. Nothing too dramatic, but I suppose that's a little tiny bit of a negative. I think Klopp might have said at one point that he got to a point in the season where he had a talk with him and kind of said, you need to almost show why we're giving you so many opportunities. You need to kind of you need to do a little bit of what Steven Gerrard did, where he just grabbed the midfield starting spot and didn't let anybody back in, to the extent where he eventually, not too long down the line, became the club's captain. But if you look at Jones as a profile, he is interesting. I don't think 4-2-3-1 is that good for him, if I'm honest, unless he was to play on the left as a forward type player rather than the midfielder. I think upon inspection of what he offers and his skill set, I don't think he's that different to Phil Foden, but he's just not as good and not as quick. Foden's speed is one of the reasons why he can play in the front line and not be an issue at all. Jones hasn't really got that. He's like a weird cross between Foden and Grealish, but not as good as either of them. I mean, maybe he is as good as Grealish when Grealish was 21. Maybe I'm being too harsh there. Grealish is probably a good example, actually, because Grealish does play on the left flank, but he's not a typical left flank player in terms of being quick enough to pose a threat in behind, and he does dawdle on the ball a little bit, but it usually benefits Grealish to do that. If you was to play Grealish in the middle of the park, maybe you'd feel a little bit concerned. So yeah, Jones is a weird profile, and it's going to be interesting to see how he develops over the next few years, specifically in Liverpool moves towards 4-2-3-1.
I am a big fan of Curtis Jones, and the only reason I was saying before about I think this year is going to be a big year for him is I think at the end of the season he'll be 22, and we've seen so often actually in even the last few years, Liverpool do make big calls on players even if they are young, of being ruthless of whether they are going to be good enough for the long term. And I personally think, yeah, he is a great player. But like you say, I think there are question marks. And I think this year it is a case of when that opportunity comes, grab it and don't let go of it. Equally, towards the back end of the season, he was the one being afforded Premier League opportunities ahead of Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, ahead of Harvey Elliot as well. So he's certainly got Jurgen Klopp's trust, but we'll have to wait and see how this season does play out for him. That's all we've time for on this edition of Analysing Anfield. Thanks for joining us and going through everything that you have done. Remember, if you want to get in touch with us here at Blood Red, you can do so with our new mailbox that is open, bloodred@reachplc.com. If you have any questions or anything of the sort to get in touch with, any feedback of any kind, do hit us up on that bloodred@reachplc.com. But from myself, Guy Clarke, and Josh Williams, thanks for your time and your company here on Analysing Anfield. It's bye for now.